Indigenous peoples of Central America, civilizations of Middle America, with me, Miss Bree. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Miss Bree, educator, farmer, illustrator, singer, and proud grammar nerd. Thank you. Welcome to the Farm School. So, today we're going to learn about Central America and the indigenous peoples that live there. But first, before we begin learning, it's important to pause and honor the stewards of the land. Okay, so we're doing a whole series, right? We're doing North America, Central America, and South America. But you're going to hear this in each one because it's so important. Okay, so a land acknowledgement is a way of recognizing the indigenous peoples who lived here and had families here and governed here and had their own cities and schools and farms here, right? Okay, they cared for the land and waters before any Europeans ever came. So this is just a really good way to help us remember that, these communities are not gone. They're still living and leading and preserving their cultures to this day. Land acknowledgements help us tell history more honestly, recognize indigenous sovereignty, build awareness and empathy, and connect learning to responsibility. But they shouldn't be empty words, okay? You should understand, and it should inspire continued education, respectful language, and continued support for Indigenous voices as they try to take back what once was theirs. So, for an example, right, I'm on the Kansas-Missouri border, all right? I'm just south of Kansas City, Missouri. So for my area, this is what a land acknowledgement for my area would be, okay? And that would be to say, this region was once home to the Kansa people. In fact, the state of Kansas is named after them. But also the Osage, the Missouri, Shawnee, Delaware, Kickapoo, and Potawatomi also lived, traded, and traveled here. These nations were not simply tribes of the past, right? They are sovereign governments today with citizens, leaders, and communities. So what you see on your screen there, that's a land acknowledgement. Okay, so we acknowledge that we are learning and living on the traditional homelands of these nations. We honor their history, their resilience, and ongoing precedence. We recognize that this land was taken through colonization. We commit to learning respectfully and supporting Indigenous communities today. All right, these land acknowledgements remind us that history didn't begin with settlers, and that respect requires both truth and action. It's not about guilt, it's about honesty. And it reminds us that every place has a story. Okay, we're showing respect by learning about their cultures and the names of their nations, their challenges and achievements. That strengthens our understanding. And when we respect them, that begins with remembering the past. So let's get started on Central America. Okay? So, you know, way back before, modern metal skyscrapers, concrete highways, or the modern farms you see today with the big tractors and things, Central America was full of life and culture and knowledge, okay? They were the first caretakers of these lands, and we're going to learn about it today. So who originally lived here? Okay, well, Indigenous American peoples are the original inhabitants of the Americas, okay? So where did they come from and how did they get here? Okay, we're going to learn about that. But we have to remember that these people were the first humans to ever live on this continent. Okay, North America, Central America, South America. All of these are the same. Okay, they all belonged to indigenous cultures, and there are hundreds of them. So, how did people even get to Central America, right? Well, tens of thousands of years before any written history, the very first peoples began a remarkable journey to where we are now, right? We're calling them the Americas. Now, one of the oldest ideas scientists have is about a giant pathway that once appeared when Earth was very cold during what's called the Ice Age, and much of the water was frozen into ice. So, because of this, the oceans were much lower, and a huge stretch of land called Beringia connected North Asia and North America. People following herds of animals and looking for new places to live could walk across this land bridge into a new world. And you have to understand that this land bridge was not like a bridge over a river, right? This land bridge was huge. It was like a whole country in and of itself, okay? People would have lived on it and existed their whole lives on it and reproduced and all sorts of things. It was highly unlikely that one person would have made it the entire way in one lifetime, okay? And yet, people did keep going. So, another idea, right, as scientists learn more, we're finding a lot of evidence that the story might even be more exciting and more complex. Archaeologists have found evidence, like ancient sites in South America, that are way older than expected, that suggest people may have arrived even earlier than once thought, and by a lot of different paths. Some researchers think that early travelers might have used boats along the Pacific coast, right? Maybe moving from island to island. There's even an idea that ancient people could have reached the Americas from the east across the Atlantic Ocean. Long, long, long time ago. Now, this idea is more controversial and not supported by most scientists, but there is some evidence for it, and it shows how curious people are about how the first Americans arrived. The other option that there is the indigenous people's beliefs themselves, right? They have oral traditions, spoken traditions that have been passed down through generations, right? Some nations believe that they came down from the land bridge, okay? Some nations believe that the Great Spirit made them the first people to exist in their area. Some of them say that they came over the sea. And you know what? There's probably a grain of truth to all of them. But here's the thing is the first Americans didn't just appear out of nowhere, right? They traveled long distances and they used what the world offered: land, sea, animals, and plants to guide their way. And just like indigenous communities today continue to share stories and knowledge, scientists continue to learn from the land, the sea, and the ancient clues that those first travelers left behind. So it's a really cool story, okay? It's really a neat thing. So, as we just talked about, there's multiple different options for how things happen. And geological change has erased a lot of the early evidence. So, between the Ice Age and now, there's been a lot of water change and, silt landing and everything. So essentially, a lot of that evidence has been erased. And so archaeology is continuing to uncover new clues every single day, right? We're finding new evidence all the time. So let's talk about the cultural regions of the Americas, right? And we're talking about Central America today. But how do we know we're talking about Central America or Middle America? Well, indigenous cultures in the Americas are usually grouped geographically. So Northern America is like the Arctic to Texas sort of area, right? Northern Mexico. Middle America is usually like Mexico to like the top of Brazil, sort of. And then South America is basically from Brazil down. Okay, it's like the South American continent. But each region developed unique adaptations shaped by their climate, their geography, and what was available to them, what food they had, what drinks they had, what was around them, You learned to live with what you had. So where is Central America? Well, to be specific, it stretches from southern Mexico through Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. It includes all sorts of geography, including tropical rainforests, mountain highlands, volcanoes, and coastal regions. That's a pretty wide selection of available um, geography, right? So let's talk about where we came from and where we got to, okay? Early cultures of Central America. So the very earliest known ancestors, okay? The first farmers, all right, in Central America are called Paleo Indians or the Lithic peoples. Okay, the Lithic peoples and Paleo Indians, these are called this no matter if you're in North America, Central America, or South America. All right, so it's kind of a blurry line there. But in Central America, we think that they started here between 8,000 and 10,000 BCE. Okay, and they started farming between 8,000 and 2,000 BCE. Okay, there were people experimenting with plants in their, um, pre-Columbian cities and on outlying lands, and they were studying corn, which was maize back then, and they're studying, okay, if we keep selecting the maize for the biggest kernels, eventually we're going to get something that really produces quite a bit. And then we're going to, hey, this plant called squash grows really well. And oh, these beans grow really well too. And hey, let's try this. This cacao looks pretty good. And that's what they did. Okay, they grew all these cool things. And then you have archaeological sites like Monteverde, which is in South America actually, but it's a good excuse, or not excuse, it's a good example that shows that people were living in the Americas way earlier than scientists once believed. Monteverde, they think, dates to 10,500 BC or earlier. Okay, so this challenges older theories and suggests the migration into the Americas was complex and happened in waves, which makes sense, right? And Central America became a bridge between North and South America, so it was a cultural crossroads, okay? Which makes sense. It's in the middle. So first, let's talk about the Olmec. Okay, the Olmec culture was kind of, they call it like the mother culture. Okay, it's kind of the mother of all of the Central American civilizations, essentially. Okay, so it predates things like the Maya and the Aztecs, things like that. The Olmec civilization, they think, is from between 1800 and 400 BCE. There is a good chance that this existed way before this, but they're just not really sure. Okay, but the Olmec are sometimes called the mother culture of Mesoamerica. Mesoamerica is another name for Central America or Middle America. But they're called that because many later civilizations inherited ideas from them, including their writing systems, religious symbols, and even their ball games. Did you know that they had ball games? Yep, just like you and I play basketball, they had their own different ball games. Also, they built these massive, colossal stone heads that they carved from volcanic rock, and they still stand today, which reminds us of their power and artistry, right? I mean, it's really amazing that they were able to create all these things. Now, religion and government were closely connected, right? Leaders often claimed divine authority. Society was organized and they had trade networks extended across regions. Okay, at one point there was pre-Columbian trade networks all the way from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego. Okay, you have to understand there is trade networks from the south of South America to the north tip of North America and everywhere in between. Okay, so no one can ever tell you that there was not a developed system. So, anyway, sorry, I got a little off track, but we're going to go back. Society was really organized, okay, and trade networks extended across the entire region. The Olmec laid cultural foundations that other cultures would build upon, okay? They practiced super complex spiritual traditions, and they had really, really amazing artwork that they've created as well. Okay, now let's talk about the rise of cities, because a lot of people think that there wasn't cities in the Americas before, modern day, but there was, and they are so cool. So, one culture that had cities was the Maya. Now, these guys were brilliant astronomers, okay? They tracked planets and created calendars more accurate than those in Europe had at the time, okay? Their cities, they built city-states like Tikal and Palenque and Copan. These city-states had pyramids, ball courts, and palaces. Religion guided agriculture, politics, and even just daily life. They developed writing systems and mathematics. They invented the zero. Isn't that crazy? So these were not random villages, right? They were carefully planned urban centers. Sometimes tens of thousands of people would live in these cities. Now, eventually, after, the civilization kind of collapsed and went away, the jungle eventually reclaimed many of the structures, but the knowledge stayed, okay? And these cities included stepped pyramids, okay? And central plazas and observatories so they could observe the stars, and even causeways connecting the different cities, which is just amazing. I mean, really, the amount of detail that went into these guys. So now let's talk about the trade and connection, okay, for Central America. Trade connected distant regions, right? So ideas, along with goods, traveled along these routes. Cultural exchange strengthened civilization across Central America. So basically, no culture developed in isolation, right? None of them didn't have access to any of the others. Okay. And some of the things that were traded were obsidian, which is that black volcanic glass, and jade and cacao, which is what cocoa is made of, and even feathers, like from pretty birds, because feathers were used in all sorts of religious things and artwork and everything. Okay. So let's talk about later developments, right? Like the Aztec, for example. That's one of the most famous. Now, the Aztec Empire, right? They built Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan was one of the largest cities in the world at the time, way larger than most European cities, okay? Their agricultural system allowed them to grow food on water. They built chinampas, which are floating gardens, okay? They basically built like a platform that they then put soil on and then they could grow on it, okay? So they basically invented hydroponics, which is the coolest thing ever. So Tenochtitlan is where modern day Mexico City is. Okay? And the Aztecs developed a complex government. They practiced elaborate religious rituals and all sorts of things. I mean, these people were amazing. And their innovation was constant. Okay? Now, I promise we will go in detail and do other videos on the Aztec and the Maya and the Inca and all these cool things. I promise, because they're really amazing societies, really cool to learn about. But we're doing a broad overview of Central America, so we'll cover that later. So now let's talk about colonialization. Okay, or colonization. I always want to say colonialization. It's colonization and its impact. Well, basically, in a nutshell, it was devastating. Okay, so the Spanish arrival in the 1500s, Columbus, basically, when they came, they brought all sorts of foreign diseases, okay, which millions of Central Americans and Northern and Southern Americans as well died from these European diseases because their systems weren't used to them, right? I mean, it's like if somebody came over from, I don't know, if you're in America, someone came from Antarctica, say a penguin came from Antarctica and sneezed on you and gave you a germ that your body wasn't used to, you'd go, and keel over because your body's not used to it. Okay? Same concept. And because of this, their cities fell and their social systems were disrupted. Okay? Also, the Spaniards, a lot of them enslaved a lot of the people. Okay? They became forced labor systems. They dispossessed them of their land. They basically just stole their land out from under them and said, "You guys are savages. You don't know what you're doing. We're going to take it from you because obviously we're better." And they also tried to convert them to Catholicism and Christianity, okay, because in the 1500s, Catholicism was the main religion then, right? And Christianity was the only religion. Now, this was technically before Martin Luther, put his document on the church, but this would meld into that. So we're just saying Christianity in general. But you have to remember that indigenous peoples did not just disappear, right? They didn't just melt and all die out. They adapted, persisted, and resisted, and they preserved their culture. One thing they did to do this was they survived by doing what's called cultural syncretism, which means they're blending cultural traditions, okay? So, for example, in Central America, you see a lot of Catholic saints blended with indigenous spiritual beliefs, okay? So, like Saint Guadalupe and other places like that. You'll also see indigenous art styles influenced the church design, okay? So, it's kind of both influenced each other, okay? And cultural resilience became a powerful force. So, we talked about colonization and its impact and all those things. Now, let's talk about living cultures. Okay, there are indigenous people of Central America, even to today, right? The Maya, there's still Mayan communities today. There's Nahui people, there's Lencos, there's all sorts of peoples there still, These cultures aren't relics of the past. They're living nations with ongoing histories. And this is by no means an all-inclusive list, okay? I can only fit so many on a slide. But these guys preserve languages. They maintain traditional agriculture. They still are advocating for land rights and participate in modern politics. And again, your important reminder that there are hundreds of indigenous nations that aren't listed in this slide. Okay? Every single nation has its own history, its own language, its own leadership, and its own cultural traditions. Remember, indigenous peoples are not one single group. They are many, many sovereign nations. So, at the end, all right, we're going to kind of try and leave on some discussion questions. Okay, so one, why was corn so important to early Central American societies? Like, what made corn such a amazing crop? Okay. Two is, how did the geography of Central America shape civilizations? Three is, what made Mayan science so advanced? Okay. Why was the science in the Maya culture so advanced? Okay, what made it that way? How did they know that? Four is, how did indigenous cultures survive colonization? And lastly, why is it important to use present tense when discussing indigenous peoples? Okay, so all of these are some really good questions to think about as you end this day, right? As we end this video. I want you to take these questions and think about them and talk about them with a friend or a parent or a teacher or just anybody and say, "Hey, what do you think?" "Well, here's what I think." And discuss it, really put some effort into it and do some research and learn. I mean, this is how you learn, is ask questions, you know? So get interested, get excited about it, and do some research. It's really cool, and there's so much to learn. So, hey, thanks for coming, guys, to this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and stay tuned for the next videos coming up. We've got quite a few, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.